Boston, 1885. The gaslight flickered against crystal chandeliers in the ballroom of the Whitmore estate, casting dancing shadows across the assembled elite of New England society. Miss Caroline Winters sat in her customary position near the potted ferns, her navy silk dress, carefully refashioned from 2 seasons prior, blending seamlessly with the damask wallpaper behind her. "Miss Winters, may I fetch you some punch?" asked Mrs. Pemberton, a kindly widow who had taken pity on Caroline over the years. "No, thank you," Caroline replied with a practiced smile that didn't reach her blue-gray eyes. "I'm quite content." Content was a lie she had perfected over 7 seasons. The daughter of Professor Winters, whose academic pursuits had left the family finances in shambles after a series of failed investments in railway bonds, Caroline had become the embodiment of social irrelevance. At 25, she was considered firmly a spinster, a fate sealed not by lack of intelligence, for she possessed a sharp mind and quiet wit, but by her father's bankruptcy and the absence of a suitable dowry. Across the ballroom, her younger sister, Margaret, laughed with a cluster of debutantes, somehow maintaining social standing despite their family's reduced circumstances. Margaret possessed a charm that Caroline had never cultivated, an ability to make people forget about money when she smiled. "She's with the Caldwell girl again," observed their mother, Mrs. Winters, who had appeared at Caroline's side with a glass of champagne she wouldn't drink. "At least one of my daughters might make an advantageous match." Caroline nodded, acknowledging the familiar sting of her mother's pragmatism without flinching. "Margaret has always been clever about her friendships," Mrs. Winters continued with a sigh. "You might learn from her example before it's entirely too late." The orchestra struck up a new waltz, and couples arranged themselves across the polished floor. Caroline watched with practiced neutrality, her expression carefully composed. 7 seasons of observation, of sitting against walls in ballrooms from Boston to Newport, had taught her to mask the longing that still resided, stubborn and foolish, within her heart. It was then that a ripple of whispers swept through the assembly like wind across water. Caroline glanced up to see the cause of the disturbance and felt her breath catch. Luke Ashford had entered the ballroom. Tall and imposing in his perfectly tailored black evening clothes, Luke moved through the crowd with the confidence of a man who answered to no one. At 34, he was at the apex of his power, a railroad magnate whose business acumen was matched only by his ruthlessness. They called him the Iron King, not only for the railways he controlled, but for his reputation for crushing competitors without mercy and his complete disregard for society's approval. His presence at a social gathering was rare enough to cause a sensation. Every unmarried woman, and several married ones, tracked his movements with barely concealed interest. Luke Ashford could have bought and sold half the men in this room, and everyone knew it. Caroline observed him with detached curiosity. Men like Luke Ashford existed in a different world than hers, one of power, ambition, and limitless possibility. Their paths would never cross. Until they did. Luke's penetrating gaze swept the room with predatory precision, and Caroline felt a jolt of disbelief when his eyes settled on her. She blinked, certain she was mistaken, but when she looked again, he was moving purposefully in her direction, cutting through the crowd like a locomotive through morning fog. Caroline glanced behind her, convinced he must be approaching someone else, but there was only the wall and a palm in a brass pot. When she turned back, he stood before her, tall and commanding, his features sharp and patrician, his eyes the color of smoke. "Miss Winters, I presume," his voice was deep, cultured, with the confidence of a man accustomed to getting exactly what he wanted. Caroline rose on unsteady legs, executing a perfect curtsy despite her shock. "Mr. Ashford, you have me at a disadvantage." A smile that didn't reach his eyes curved his lips. "I make it my business to know everyone worth knowing in Boston society, Miss Winters." The statement was so patently absurd, she was decidedly not worth knowing by society's standards, that Caroline nearly laughed. Instead, she raised a skeptical eyebrow. "Then your intelligence gatherers have misled you, Mr. Ashford." Something flickered in his eyes, surprise perhaps at her candor. Around them, conversations faltered as people strained to overhear their exchange. Mrs. Caldwell nearly dropped her fan. Margaret's mouth hung open in an unladylike gape. and Miss Victoria Hampton, the season's reigning beauty with her golden curls and substantial fortune, watched with narrowed eyes as Luke Ashford, whom everyone believed would eventually offer for her, instead approached the invisible Miss Winters. "On the contrary," he replied, his voice lowering to a timbre that seemed to resonate in her very bones, "I believe they have led me precisely where I needed to be." The orchestra began the opening notes of a waltz. Luke extended his hand to her, his gaze never leaving hers. "Dance with me." It wasn't a question, but a command, softly delivered yet unmistakable in its authority. Carolyn knew she should refuse. Dancing with Luke Ashford would invite speculation, gossip, and inevitable disappointment when nothing came of it. She had spent 7 years cultivating invisibility as protection against society's cruelty. One dance could shatter that shield, yet her hand moved of its own accord, settling into his palm. Yes. As he led her onto the floor, every eye in the ballroom followed them. Mrs. Pemberton looked like she might faint. Margaret appeared stunned into silence, and Victoria Hampton's perfect features twisted with barely concealed fury. "Everyone is staring," Caroline murmured as Luke's hand settled at her waist with surprising gentleness. "Let them," he replied simply, before sweeping her into the waltz with practiced ease. Dancing with Luke Ashford was like being caught in a storm, exhilarating and terrifying in equal measure. He moved with fluid grace that belied his powerful build, guiding her through the steps as if they had danced together countless times before. "You dance well, Miss Winters," he observed, his expression inscrutable. "The benefit of 7 seasons of observation, Mr. Ashford," she replied. "One has ample time to study technique when not participating." Again, that flicker in his eyes. "You speak quite frankly." "A habit my mother despairs of correcting." Carolyn found herself relaxing slightly into the rhythm of the dance. "May I ask why you've chosen to dance with me this evening? Surely there are more advantageous partners available to you." Luke's grip tightened almost imperceptibly on her waist. "I find that advantage is a relative concept, Miss Winters. What appears disadvantageous to some may be precisely what others seek." "And what do you seek, Mr. Ashford?" His gaze intensified, seeming to look beyond her carefully composed exterior to something deeper. "A woman who understands the value of directness. A woman without illusions." The waltz ended before Carolyn could formulate a response. Luke escorted her back to her corner, bowed formally over her hand, and instead of departing, leaned closer. "I would speak with you further, Miss Winters. Perhaps you might join me in the conservatory in 10 minutes' time." It was improper, scandalously so, yet Caroline found herself nodding before she could consider the wisdom of such a meeting. Luke straightened, gave her a look that seemed to contain both warning and promise, and strode away, leaving whispers and speculation in his wake. 10 minutes later, having slipped away from the ballroom with a whispered excuse to Mrs. Pemberton, Caroline stood in the glass-walled conservatory, surrounded by exotic plants and the scent of night-blooming jasmine. "Miss Winters." Luke's voice came from behind a towering fern before he emerged, his tall figure silhouetted against the gaslight from the house. "Mr. Ashford." Carolyn's voice was steady despite the impropriety of their meeting. "I confess I'm curious about what matter could be so urgent as to require a clandestine conversation." "I require a wife," he stated without preamble. Caroline blinked, certain she had misheard. "I beg your pardon?" "I require a wife," he repeated, moving closer, his features now visible in the dim light. "And I believe you would suit my purposes admirably." "Your purposes?" "My business partner, Thomas Crawford, died 6 months ago in a factory accident. He left behind a daughter, my goddaughter, Sarah. She's 8 years old and currently in the care of her maternal aunt, a woman of questionable character who sees the child as nothing more than a future source of income through an advantageous marriage. I'm very sorry for your loss, Mr. Ashford, but I fail to see. The aunt, Mrs. Blackwell, has petitioned the courts to be named Sarah's legal guardian. She's claimed that my bachelor status and reputation make me an unsuitable guardian for a young girl." His jaw tightened. "I need a wife to demonstrate stability and respectability. The hearing is in 6 weeks, understanding dawned. And a wife would make you appear more suitable." "Precisely." He nodded approvingly. The court needs to see a stable, respectable household before they'll grant me guardianship. But surely someone of your standing could have any number of suitable brides. Miss Hampton, for instance, has made her interest quite clear." Luke's expression hardened. "I have no interest in Miss Hampton or any woman who seeks my fortune above all else. What I need, Miss Winters, is a practical arrangement with a woman who harbors no romantic illusions about marriage to me. And you believe I fit that description because you have observed society from its margins for years. You understand its hypocrisies and cruelties. You speak directly when others would simper and flatter." He added with brutal honesty, "And your family's financial situation is dire enough that a practical arrangement would be welcome." Heat rose to Caroline's cheeks, not from embarrassment, but from indignation. "You've investigated my family's finances." "I investigate everything that concerns me, Miss Winters." "And what exactly would this practical arrangement entail?" "Marriage, of course. You would become Mrs. Luke Ashford, mistress of Ashford House in the Berkshires, and guardian to Sarah. Your father's debts would be settled, a generous allowance arranged for your parents and sister. In return, you would provide the respectability I need to secure guardianship." "And after the guardianship is secured?" Luke's gaze was steady. "We would continue our arrangement. You would have your own suite of rooms. Your obligations would be social in nature, hosting necessary gatherings, appearing at my side when required. Beyond that, your time would be your own." "A marriage in name only, then?" Something flashed in his eyes, too quickly to interpret. "Unless mutually agreed otherwise." Caroline turned away, moving to examine a potted orchid with intense focus. A marriage to a man who wanted her for practicality rather than any deeper connection. It should have been offensive. Yet wasn't it more honest than the false flattery that characterized so many marriages of her acquaintance? And what were her alternatives? Another 7 seasons of sitting against walls, watching Margaret marry while she herself became the spinster aunt dependent on charity? "You need not answer immediately," Luke said, breaking the silence. "I'll call upon you tomorrow at 2:00. We can discuss the terms more thoroughly." Caroline turned back to face him. "And if I refuse?" For the first time, uncertainty crossed his features. "Then I shall have to seek another solution." "Another practical bride, you mean?" "Yes." The admission was candid. "Though I suspect I would be hard-pressed to find one who intrigues me as you do, Miss Winters." Before she could respond to this unexpected statement, the conservatory door opened, spilling light and music into their private conversation. Luke stepped away from her with practiced ease. "Consider my proposal," he said quietly. "Until tomorrow, Miss Winters." With a formal bow, he departed, leaving Caroline alone with the exotic plants and a decision that would alter the course of her life forever. Caroline accepted Luke's proposal the following afternoon, signing papers in her father's study that outlined the terms of their arrangement with legal precision. The wedding took place 3 weeks later in a quiet ceremony at Trinity Church, with only her immediate family and a handful of Luke's business associates in attendance. The absence of society at such a significant union caused nearly as much gossip as the hasty nature of their engagement. Caroline became Mrs. Luke Ashford on a rainy Tuesday morning, and by that evening she was traveling west to the Berkshires to begin her new life. Ashford House proved to be an imposing mansion of gray stone set against the backdrop of rolling hills and dense forests. It was beautiful in a stark, commanding way, much like its owner. "Sarah will arrive tomorrow," Luke informed her as they stood in the grand entrance hall, surrounded by dark wood paneling and stern portraits of Ashford ancestors. "I thought you might want a day to settle in first." "That was thoughtful of you," Caroline replied, though she wondered if it had been thoughtfulness or merely another calculated detail in his meticulous planning. Her suite of rooms proved to be surprisingly comfortable. A sitting room in soft greens and golds, a bedroom with a view of the gardens, and even a small library stocked with current novels and poetry collections. "I took the liberty of having my secretary select some books," Luke said from the doorway, watching her examine the shelves. "If they're not to your taste, please feel free to make changes." "They're perfect," Caroline said honestly, running her fingers over the leather spines. "Thank you." An awkward silence fell between them, the reality of their situation suddenly very present. They were married, yet strangers. She wore his ring and bore his name, yet knew almost nothing of the man beyond the carefully worded agreement they had signed. "I should let you rest," Luke said finally. "Dinner's at 7. Until then, please make yourself at home." After he left, Caroline moved to the window, looking out over the unfamiliar landscape. What had she done? Married. A man who needed her for appearances, agreed to raise a child not her own, left everything familiar behind for this grand, cold house and its enigmatic master. Yet, as the afternoon light slanted across the gardens, Caroline felt something unexpected stir within her, not regret, but possibility. Perhaps in this practical arrangement, freed from the expectations and judgments of society, she might finally discover who she truly was. Sarah Crawford arrived the next morning, a thin child with serious dark eyes and brown hair pulled back in severe braids. She curtsied perfectly when introduced to Caroline, but said nothing, watching her new guardian with wary assessment. "Sarah has been well educated," the escort, a stern-faced woman from the court, informed them. "She excels at her studies and is quite accomplished for her age." "How wonderful," Caroline replied warmly, kneeling to Sarah's level despite the woman's visible disapproval of such informality. "I hope you'll show me your favorite books while you're here. The library at Ashford House is quite extensive." The child glanced uncertainly at the escort, as if seeking permission to respond. At the woman's curt nod, she murmured, "Yes, Mrs. Ashford," in a voice so soft it was barely audible. Luke, who had been observing with unusual tension in his bearing, stepped forward. "Perhaps you'd like to see your room, Sarah. Mrs. Ashford and I have had it prepared especially for you." Once the escort had departed, muttering about impropriety and lack of discipline, the change in Sarah was immediate. She threw herself into Luke's arms with such force he stumbled back a step. "Uncle Luke, I've missed you so much." He held her close, one large hand cradling the back of her head with surprising tenderness. "And I've missed you, little bird. Have you been well?" "Aunt Blackwell says I cannot come to live with you because you're a bachelor, and bachelors are unsuitable for raising children. But now you have a wife, so I can stay, can't I?" Luke glanced at Caroline, a silent communication passing between them. "That is my hope, yes. And speaking of my wife, I believe it's time you became better acquainted with her." Sarah turned her solemn gaze to Caroline, assessing her with a child's direct curiosity. "Are you really married to Uncle Luke?" Caroline smiled, charmed by the question. "I am indeed, though it's still quite new to me. Aunt Blackwell says ladies who marry for money are no better than—" Sarah stopped abruptly, her face flushing. "I probably shouldn't say what she said." "Probably not," Caroline agreed gently. "But I think your Aunt Blackwell doesn't understand that sometimes people marry for many different reasons, and all of them can be perfectly respectable." Sarah considered this with a child's seriousness. "Did you marry Uncle Luke for money?" The blunt question deserved an honest answer. "I married your uncle because I believe we can build a good home together, one where you would be happy and safe. And yes, his offer came at a time when my family needed help. But that doesn't make our marriage any less real or important." "That's a good answer," Sarah said, nodding approvingly. "Papa always said honesty was the best policy, even when the truth isn't pretty." "Your father sounds like he was a wise man," Caroline said softly. Sarah's eyes filled with sudden tears. "I miss him so much. And Mama, too. Aunt Blackwell says I shouldn't talk about them because it makes everyone sad." Caroline reached out and took the child's hand. "I think remembering the people we love is one of the most important things we can do, even when it makes us sad sometimes. Your father and mother deserve to be remembered and talked about." Luke watched this exchange with an expression Caroline couldn't quite read. When Sarah asked if they could visit her father's grave that afternoon, he agreed immediately, his voice rough with emotion. Over the following weeks, Caroline discovered that being a guardian to Sarah was both easier and harder than she had anticipated. The child was intelligent, curious, and surprisingly resilient, but she carried deep wounds from her parents' death and her aunt's cold treatment. Slowly, patiently, Caroline worked to build trust, reading with Sarah, walking in the gardens, teaching her to sketch the birds that visited the feeders outside the library windows. Luke proved to be a devoted guardian, despite his business commitments. He made time each evening to dine with them, to hear about Sarah's day, to read her the adventure stories she loved before bed. Caroline watched him with growing interest, seeing beyond the ruthless reputation to the man who removed spiders from Sarah's room and taught her to ride her pony with infinite patience. "You're good with her," Caroline observed one evening after Sarah had gone to bed. They sat in his study, she with her needlework, he with his business correspondence. "Sarah deserves someone who cares," Luke replied, setting aside his papers. "Her father was my closest friend. I owe it to him to protect his daughter." "You do more than protect her. You love her." Luke's expression softened. "Thomas and I were like brothers. When he died, it felt like I'd lost part of myself. Sarah is all I have left of him." It was the most personal thing he'd shared with her since their marriage. Caroline set aside her needlework, giving him her full attention. "Tell me about him." And so Luke did, opening up about his friendship with Thomas Crawford, about building their railroad empire together, about the accident that had taken his friend's life. As he spoke, Caroline saw the depth of feeling Luke typically concealed behind his cold exterior, grief, loyalty, and a fierce determination to honor his friend's memory by raising Sarah well. "The hearing is next week," Luke said finally, his voice heavy. "Everything depends on convincing the court that we can provide Sarah with a stable, loving home." "We can," Caroline said with quiet certainty. "Because we do." Luke's eyes met hers across the study, and something passed between them, an acknowledgement that somewhere in the past weeks their practical arrangement had begun to shift into something more real. The court hearing took place in a formal chamber that smelled of old wood and legal documents. Caroline sat beside Luke, their hands clasped, presenting the united front they'd practiced. Mrs. Blackwell, a sharp-featured woman with calculating eyes, sat across from them with her lawyer. The proceedings were grueling, with Mrs. Blackwell's attorney painting Luke as an unsuitable guardian, too focused on business, too ruthless in his dealings, with a marriage that was obviously one of convenience. When it was Caroline's turn to testify, she spoke from the heart about Sarah's progress, her growing happiness, the home they'd created together at Ashford House. She spoke about bedtime stories and pony rides, about teaching Sarah to sketch and watching her confidence bloom. "Mrs. Ashford," the judge asked, "do you love this child?" Caroline didn't hesitate. "I do, Your Honor. I didn't expect to when I agreed to this arrangement, but Sarah has become dear to me in ways I never anticipated." "And your husband? Do you believe he's capable of raising a young girl properly?" Caroline looked at Luke, seeing past the Iron King to the man who read adventure stories with different voices for each character, who held Sarah when she cried for her parents, who somehow made a little girl laugh despite his fearsome reputation. "I believe my husband is one of the most capable men I've ever known, Your Honor. He's devoted to Sarah's welfare and happiness. Any claims otherwise simply don't know him as I do." The judge's decision came 2 days later. Guardianship granted to Luke and Caroline Ashford, with visitation rights for Mrs. Blackwell should she choose to exercise them in good faith. When they told Sarah, the child's joy was so pure, so complete, that Caroline found tears streaming down her face. Luke pulled them both into his arms, his own eyes suspiciously bright. "We're a family now," Sarah said, looking up at them with wonder. "A real family." "Yes," Luke agreed, his voice rough. "A real family." That night, after Sarah was asleep, Luke found Caroline in the library. She was curled in a chair by the fire, a book forgotten in her lap. "Caroline," he said, and something in his tone made her look up. "I need to tell you something." He moved closer, taking the chair beside hers. "When I proposed our arrangement, I thought I had everything calculated. A wife for appearances, stability for the court, security for Sarah. What I didn't calculate was you." Caroline's heart began to beat faster. "What do you mean?" "I mean that somewhere between our wedding and tonight, this stopped being an arrangement and became something real. You're not just a wife in name, Caroline. You're the woman who made this house a home, who loved my goddaughter when you had no obligation to, who showed me that perhaps the ruthless Luke Ashford could become someone better." He took her hand in his touch warm and certain. "I love you, Caroline Winters Ashford, not for your practicality or your usefulness, though I value both. I love your compassion, your quiet strength, the way you've transformed my life without even trying. I love that you dance with invisible grace and see straight through society's pretensions. I love that you made me want to be worthy of you." Caroline's breath caught. "I love you too," she whispered. "I didn't think I could, didn't think I should, but I do. You're nothing like what society believes you to be, Luke. You're so much more." The kiss they shared was unlike their chaste wedding kiss. This was a kiss of promise and passion, of a marriage transformed from convenience into something profound and lasting. "I'd like to court you properly," Luke murmured against her lips. "My own wife, if she'll have me." Caroline laughed, joy bubbling up inside her. "I believe I would like that very much." And so the Iron King and the invisible wallflower, who had married for the most practical of reasons, discovered what Sarah had known all along, that they had become a real family, bound not by contracts, but by love. Summer came to the Berkshires, and with it, a lightness to Ashford House that had never existed before. Sarah thrived, growing taller and more confident with each passing day. Luke, still formidable in business, revealed a gentler side at home, teaching Caroline to ride, joining them for picnics, even agreeing to play elaborate games of make-believe that his goddaughter devised. As for Caroline, she who had sat invisible at balls for 7 years, she finally found where she belonged, not on society's margins, but at the center of her own story, loved by a man who saw her clearly and a child who called her mother in all but name. One evening, as they stood together on the terrace watching Sarah chase fireflies across the lawn, Luke pulled Caroline close. "Do you remember the night we met?" he asked. "When I crossed that ballroom to ask you to dance?" "Of course. I thought you must be mistaken, that you couldn't possibly want to dance with the invisible Miss Winters." "You were never invisible to me," Luke said softly. "Even then I saw you. I just didn't realize I was seeing my future." Caroline smiled, resting her head against his shoulder as Sarah's laughter floated up to them on the warm summer breeze. She had sat alone at every ball for 7 years, resigned to invisibility and spinsterhood, until the most ruthless man in Boston had whispered, "Dance with me." And what a dance it had been, transforming from a practical arrangement into the greatest love story of her life.